Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Jamila.
Charlie.
Thanks,
so
Paul.
one of the many
Thanks,
things
Chapter
that
six.
You always hear
Damn.
racism affects all.
Thanks, Jamila. What happened to the world's largest pool? So big that it had sanded beaches. Well, let me show you. On June 21st, 1949, in St. Louis, Fairground Park Pool was a jewel of the city. But the first wave of black swimmers was allowed in after integration, and as you might expect, a mob of white Americans refused to allow this. Starting with 200 people with bricks and knives, they attacked the protesters and started a riot. By the end of the night, thousands of white people had come to terrorize the black American citizens of St. Louis. I am from St. Louis, and I never heard of this, and I know a lot of you haven't either. But why is it important to dredge up an old race riot today? Well, because this wasn't even the only time a public pool was closed in this way. In Winona, Mississippi, in Montgomery, Alabama. Here's a quote. The council decided to drain the pool rather than share it with their black neighbors. Later, uncomprehending white children cried as the city contractors poured dirt into the pool, paved it over, and seeded it with grass. Don't get it twisted. The people who were attacked by a mob had it worse than those kids. But the reality is, when those parents came home to explain to them why they were closing the pool, they were taught about American white history in that moment that rather like a cancer, we would rather slowly destroy the body that is keeping us alive. A functioning society rests on a web of mutuality, a willingness among all involved to share enough with one another to accomplish what no one person can do alone. The last 60 years of American politics have been slowly dismantling the public systems that have kept us alive, from roads and bridges to housing and education. This web of mutuality, like Kimberly Jones explains, is what the social contract is. As you watch the other videos, or you listen to her podcast, or you go to her webinar, you will see so many examples of how white Americans would rather harm themselves than share the world. But I don't want to get all doom and gloom on you, because the flip side is actually incredibly hopeful. If destroying the public pool hurts both white kids and black kids, what would happen if we started refilling them? You probably noticed this was a collab. All of these creators are involved. EK has the next video. You can upload your own take on this book with the hashtag Community Book Report and tag us. Giveaway details coming soon on Instagram.
Charlie, so one of the many things that resonated with me about The Sum of Us was healthcare, or rather, why doesn't the United States have a form of universal healthcare like other Western nations? And she pointed out a story about Harry Truman's attempt to give us universal healthcare back in the 1940s as part of his Fair Deal plan. There was no greater champion for that healthcare plan than a Southern Democratic senator from Florida by the name of Claude Pepper. But you know who was against universal healthcare at that time? Doctors. The American Medical Association deemed it socialist, and during Pepper's 1950 re-election campaign, they, along with anti-Pepper businessmen, used several red-baiting tactics to scare voters away from him. But they didn't stop there. They collected any picture of them they could find with black people, including one of him standing with black activist Paul Robeson, and published them in a newspaper claiming that he was paying black people to vote for him. And like that, the South lost its champion for universal health care, and without the support of the South, the bill was dead in the water. Now, Truman's health care plan would have been truly universal, which meant it would have included black people. And at that time, less than 1/3 of people had any form of health insurance. It would have covered the vast majority of the country, and white people would have overwhelmingly been its beneficiaries, as they made up over 90% of the population at the time. But equity in healthcare was a cross too big to bear. Now, I talk a lot about having respect for the way people speak, and that language has nothing to do with intelligence on my accounts. And while the majority of my videos are about African American English, the fact is white people will also overwhelmingly be the beneficiaries of my teachings. Because think about it, especially those of you from the South, but just in general, when is the last time you've heard anything other than a standard American non-accent be presented as anything other than a stereotype or decoupled from intelligence? Helping us helps you, but holding us back holds you back as well. That has been a community book report. Now for the next chapter, I'm going to hand it off to my friend Paul, aka Neon X Death. You can find him right here.
Thanks, EK. You always hear racism affects all of us, but you don't always get receipts. But that's not the case for the subject of this community book report, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, an economic look at racial practice in America. Me and a bunch of my TikTok friends are reviewing it chapter by chapter. Mine is chapter 4, Ignoring the Canary. The year is 2009. I'm a young musician in his 20s working retail at a camping store. I got no stocks. I don't care about Wall Street. I got no house. I don't know what a subprime loan is. This stuff doesn't really affect me, right? Record scratch, freeze frame. There it is, that was me. I bet you're wondering how I got here. I suddenly found myself without income, health insurance, or prospects. I was dumbfounded. How had it felt so safe until suddenly it wasn't? It turns out it had only felt safe for me and people who look like me. Predatory lending institutions had been literally practicing various types of toxic loans and refinances on people of color since the 90s. Among other things, racially motivated predatory lending allowed the banks to perfect a process called securitization, a way to separate themselves from any sort of risk at the expense of the loan's recipient. It became such common practice, they had an acronym for it. IBG-YBG. I'll be gone, you'll be gone. Another thing I didn't realize that I learned from this book is that the majority of subprime loans were refinances. It wasn't just ignorant young new homebuyers. It was people who already had houses, who had been paying them off sometimes for decades and literally got lied to so that somebody else could make a commission. I also didn't realize how many recipients of subprime loans also qualified for a much better deal that just wouldn't have resulted in the same commission for the snake oil salesman who knew that they could use historically, systematically racist justifications like redlining to get away with it for years until the mid-2000s. They thought they had it all figured out. They thought they had it down to such a science that they could now expand the predatory lending practices to a wider audience while staying afloat. And as we all know, they were wrong. Institutions started dropping like flies. It affected people like me, and that is when the nation finally started to take action. Black, Latino, and indigenous homeowners had been sounding the alarm for years, along with plenty of financial scholars, but they just couldn't drum up the kind of legal or media attention that would elicit the proper response to the impending disaster. And in 2009, directly thanks to these racist practices by financial institutions, I lost my job. The economy is not a zero-sum game. By working together, we all prosper. This has been a community book report on The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. We are giving away 3 copies of the book. Follow every creator in the chain and make at least 1 comment on a video and you might win. Rebecca, you're up.
All right, thanks, Paul. So I picked chapter 5 in The Sum of Us to make my book report on because I think it really highlights this idea of sacrificing doing better for like the phantom advantage of doing better than. And this is a particularly useful tool for separating working people who would otherwise be natural allies. So in this chapter, she talks about these union members who, the white ones, vote against the thing that would help them because they think that it will close the gap, the material gap between them and their black counterparts. And I just find that fascinating because people will accept really terrible circumstances. They'll celebrate really terrible circumstances as long as someone is doing worse. And it's preposterous, but it happens all the time. And actually reading this chapter helped me understand something my mom said to me a million years ago. I was 9 or 10, I was really sick. Like fever dream, like night sweats, miserably sick. And she walked in, and she sat down at my bedside and she said, you know, Becky, she calls me Becky. One time I was at the hospital and I saw a boy with no feet. And I, of course, like I'm an empathetic kid, I'm thoughtful, I burst into tears and I was thinking like, how could she be so cruel? You know, like how could she tell me this awful story about another child's suffering when I'm already feeling so bad? But if she's bought into the better than myth, she maybe thought that that would make me feel better. But the ugly lie about the better than myth is that her telling me that awful story didn't bring my fever down. It didn't fight the germs. It didn't help me breathe better. It's not real. And that's the thing, like the better than myth is incredibly hollow. It's hollow like the identity of anybody who builds their self-image on a foundation of comparison, on being better than. And I know this is kind of getting off topic, but I'm ceaselessly fascinated about how few of my friends and family members really know what they want outside of just winning the comparison game. Anyway, I love this book. I hope you read it. That's my part in the hashtag Community Book Report. I hope you read this book. I'm really looking forward to seeing your stitches and duets. And with that, I will pass the baton on to Uncle Dan.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, I'm D.L. Hopkins, but I'm more familiar as Uncle Dan on TikTok. Your forbidden historian. I'd like to briefly unpack a perspective on Chapter 6, Never a Real Democracy, from Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us. The promise of American democracy has not only never been fully realized, but we have a very tangible and daily reminder of its unattainability. As an American, like many others, African American, is presented as a hyphenation, but in actuality, that hyphen is a minus sign, a reminder that I am exempt from the full rights and promises of American democracy.
If we accept this universal mail-out balloting to people who didn't even request ballots, I don't think Republicans will ever win another national election again.
They had things, levels of voting that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
Republicans created the entire system, and they were perfectly happy with it until Democrats and black voters started using it to their benefit. Only when Democrats started winning in Georgia and black voters turned out in record numbers did they start trying to repeal all of the things that Republicans bragged about that made it easy to vote.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
We probably had a better election. Think about this. We cut Obama by 5%, which was big. You know, a lot of people lost sight of that. He won. He beat McCain by 10%, and he beat Romney by 5%. I think that probably photo ID had helped a bit in that.
It's at a competitive disadvantage relative to Democrats. Politics is a zero-sum game. It's the difference between winning an election 50 to 49 and losing an election.
Okay, thank you. My time is up.
For further examples, we need not look back into this country's dark past for examples of entrenched structural racism. It can be found in the policies, the words, and the deeds of our lawmakers and leaders today. But if we were to glimpse back for an example that epitomizes the perceived place for myself and my family in this American tapestry, it would be found in the third verse of Francis Scott Key's Star Spangled Banner. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave, and the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Well, that's my time, and I thank you for listening. Again, I'm D.L. Hopkins, a.k.a. Uncle Dan, and as always, praise the sixth! And now my good friend Laura will round out our Some of Us Community Book Report with Chapter 9, Colorblindness. Laura?
Thank you, Uncle Dan. I want to talk to you all about colorblindness. I'm sure you all know somebody who is a nice white person who believes that they have not a racist bone in their body. In fact, they are colorblind. They don't see color. There's a beautiful analogy of the bird cage. People like this identify specific disadvantages that people of color face as one wire at a time, without acknowledging the truth that all of those wires work together to entrap. From Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us. If racism is no longer actively limiting the lives of people of color, then their failure to achieve parity with whites in wealth, education, employment, and other areas must mean that there is something wrong with them, not with the social systems that somehow benefit white people the most. That sounds a lot like internalized white supremacy to me. I recommend you grab your own copy. On to you, Jamila.
Thanks, Laura. So this real smart black lady wrote a book called The Sum of Us. Let's take a ride. First off, the zero-sum concept says you can only win if somebody else loses. You can only have another apple if I take one from somebody else. Now, equal rights don't work that way, but for some reason in America, white people think that it does. They engage in zero-sum thinking politically. Progress for Black people has to come at the expense of theirs. So they support political and economic choices that are against their own interests. How did this happen? Slavery, of course, friend! In Chapter 1, Heather McGhee tells the old story of the zero-sum hierarchy. The zero-sum narrative was sold to middle and lower-class white people, putting them in a better position racially, so it would take them longer to see what was going on economically. And that's just Chapter 1. My friend Charlie's going to talk about Chapter 2. Read with us and join the Community Book Report.